Good morning and welcome to our FEMA mitigation programs and grant application session. We'll be starting off with Camille Crain, the BRIC section chief at FEMA, on the new building resilient infrastructure and community, what stakeholders should know.
Hello, everyone. I would like to talk to you today about the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, what we lovingly call BRIC. It is FEMA's newest mitigation grant program. My name is Camille Crain. I'm the section chief for FEMA headquarters and responsible for the design and implementation. So with all that, let's get started. As you can tell, we have a jam-packed agenda and not a lot of time. So moving forward, I'm going to start with where we came from. And so where we came from is the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. We are specifically Section 1234. That gives us our authority to build this program, and we're amending Section 203 of the Stafford Act. How we're funded, it's 6% of post-disaster funding from FEMA gets put into a BRIC piggy bank, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. Who are eligible? So our states and our territories with a major disaster declaration in the last 7 years, as well as our tribes, are eligible applicants under BRIC. And right now that covers the entire United States, because right now all states and territories, plus the District of Columbia, have a disaster declaration. We are replacing the current PDM program. So PDM 19 completed its last application cycle. The applications were due January 31st, and FEMA just made determinations for identified for further review for those grants. And so BRIC will take over and start funding in the year 2020. After our legislation was passed, we went into a very robust, informal stakeholder feedback because we wanted to learn and get a lot of feedback from our constituents before we built this program, because it's not every day we get the chance to build a brand new program. So that feedback in the summer of 2019 led to 5,000 non-attributable individual comments, as well as 75 letters. We distilled all that information, and our leadership created what are our guiding principles. And these guiding principles, these 6 guiding principles, are what we're doing all of our implementation or all of our design and implementation to. So our guiding principles include supporting communities, capability and capacity building, and you're going to see elements of the program that drive specifically into that. We want to encourage and enable innovation. And I know that can make people nervous sometimes, but we want people to be innovative within where they are. So innovation doesn't look the same to all communities, but how are you being innovative in your community? We want to promote partnerships and be very intentional about that, about how we are trying to drive people together. We know that BRIC funding on its own are not going to solve all the mitigation needs of the country. So we need to be able to help people partner. We want to enable large infrastructure projects. So we're looking at the funding caps we have so that we can potentially do larger projects. We want to maintain flexibility. And we are a program that we hope to build and better ourselves year on year. We learn from year to year. We also know that the way that our funding is driven by that 6% of disaster cost means we could have different amounts of funding from year to year. So we want to have a program that has that flexibility for those factors. And then we want to provide consistency. So we are one of 3 grant programs within hazard mitigation assistance. So we want to make sure that where there are good things in those programs and where we can be consistent with those programs, we are. We also are building a program that supports FEMA's strategic plan. By goal number 1, building a culture of preparedness. We want to help increase the investment in mitigation, readying the nation for catastrophic disasters. By doing some of those larger infrastructure projects, we hope to lessen the effect of those catastrophic disasters. And then with building any new grant program, we are paying attention to the complexity we put into it and not in trying to create burden on our applicants and sub-applicants. We recently had our policy out for Federal Register, and that closed May 11th. We're going through all those comments and adjudicating all of them so we can produce our final policy. Some of those key factors you saw in that draft policy were, because really it's meant to be a framework that the program can be built upon. We're talking about how we divide the money out. So we have a state and territory allocation. So every state and territory will get a flat or same allocation amount. That amount will be listed in the NOFO. We're going to have a tribal set aside, so a specific pot of money for our tribal applicants. You'll see that also amount in the NOFO. And the balance of the funding will be in a competition, a national competition. We have a requirement that we have the majority of the funding go towards this national competition. And so that's the way we're structuring it. How can you use the money? There are 4 different areas that we're focusing on. The first is technical assistance, and we're actually going to have a new kind of element to our program, which is a non-financial direct technical assistance. Then through our allocation, we're looking at capacity and capability building activities. So what we call CNCB. So what are those CNCB activities that help a community or a state build capacity and capability to enact their own resilience or mitigation? Then, of course, we're funding mitigation projects and management cost. Just to give one kind of pull out from the policy that makes us different than the PDM program that we're replacing is how we handle pre-award cost. Pre-award costs are, of course, those costs that are incurred before the opening of the application period or before award, I should say before award, to put together the application to be able to have it funded. One thing we're changing is there's no set, it used to be the date you could start incurring those costs for the opening of the application period. We're removing that date. So any costs that were incurred to put the application together, no matter when that time was, is eligible for pre-award. Of course, you don't get the funding back unless the project is selected, but at least that gives you a longer window to start putting your application together. Where we are right now, and this is what I lovingly call my pizza tracker. So I was very excited on May 11th when we closed the Federal Register notice for the public comment. We got to move our red arrow one to the right. So as we are finalizing the policy, finalizing the NOFO, we are doing sessions like today, where we're doing rollout and training on the BRIC program. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to start doing some of our own engagements at FEMA starting in July. Then the next step will be moving into the notice of funding opportunity. That's going to give all the details of the program that weren't in the policy. And we're looking at having that in late summer in the August timeframe, and then the application opening up in fall towards the end of September. So everyone always asks, how is BRIC funded? BRIC is funded through a disaster declaration. So this is what we call the piggy bank slide. So basically, when a DR or a major disaster declaration happens, 180 days after that declaration, we pull 6% of certain sections. There's 8 different sections of the Stafford Act that fund BRIC. We pull the estimate at 180 days. And so at that point, that estimate goes into a little account within the disaster relief fund that is for BRIC. So the BRIC piggy bank. So every time a disaster hits 180 days, money goes into the piggy bank. So we just accrue money continually. And then once a year, we'll pull a certain amount of funding, or we'll pull the funding from the piggy bank, and that'll be that year's BRIC program. So we get a lot of questions about how is BRIC different than PDM. So here's just kind of a list of things we've captured that we are different. One is we're going to have different priorities for funding. So we're going to be looking at lifeline infrastructure projects. We have an importance on building codes. Building codes is actually written into section 1234 of the DRRA. So we're looking at how we're doing building codes, or how we're treating building codes in the program. We are putting a priority on shared responsibilities and partnerships, and then on innovation. How are communities being innovative for them, either in project design or management of the project itself? We want to build capacity and capability. So that includes, we talked about a little bit about that with the allocation amount. That includes activities such as project scoping, which used to be known as advanced assistance, so some seed money to help you build an application. It has planning, mitigation planning is in there. Also, building code projects. So how can we help communities, if they don't have code, building code, adopt building code, enforce better their code. We'll also, like I said, going to have a in-person non-financial technical assistance to a small cohort of communities. More information coming out from that with the NOFO. And then one of the things we really heard about in the stakeholder feedback was the tell me what a BRIC project looks like. So we have created, and we are making the final edits to it now, so we will have it delivered with the NOFO, is what we're calling the Mitigation Action Portfolio, or MAP. And it is a collection of 2-page case studies that give you a taste of things that would be eligible under BRIC, or might be good projects for BRIC. And they run the gamut across the country, different hazard types, different geography, different size projects from small to large, soft projects like building codes or planning versus hard projects like wastewater treatment centers or seismic retrofits. So they just cover the gamut. And they're meant to give you quick snapshots, and it's buildable over time too. We hope to have this continue to be updated. Another thing we want to do is increase flexibility. So we're looking at where we can reduce limitations, where we can potentially increase caps and allow pre-award. And all those caps and limitations will be listed in the NOFO that's coming out in August. And then we're looking how we can streamline processes. We're going into a new application system, FEMA Go. So training for it will be coming out soon. We're also looking at how we do project extensions and allowing phased projects in BRIC. I get a lot of questions about, will this project still be eligible under BRIC? And yes, everything that's been eligible in HMA or in PDM and listed and eligible in the 2015 HMA guidance is still eligible in BRIC. In addition to all those project types, we're including new projects. So we're putting in the project scoping, formerly known as advanced assistance, under the allocations. We're adding the building code projects that are under the allocations. And then we have additional project types that have been put into the program from section 1205 for wildfire and wind, and 1233, early earthquake warning. So those are eligible as well. At the same time, I always want to drill down to, we don't ever have an exhaustive list of this is everything that's eligible. And that's one reason we're encouraging innovation. At its heart, a project must meet the criteria that's outlined in the navy box or the blue box on the right. And that is, it must be cost effective. It must reduce or eliminate risk and damages from natural hazards. It has to meet, if it's a construction project, has to meet one of the latest 2 consensus codes for that type of project. For example, if it was something that would be subject to the IBC or the International Building Code, it would be the 2015 or 2018. It must align with a local and state or tribal hazard mitigation plan that's approved, and it has to meet all environmental and historic preservation requirements. In addition, these are things that I like to talk about that when you're talking about a competitive project or elements of good competitive mitigation projects. One is they show that risk reduction. How are they increasing resiliency? How is that project having other benefits, ancillary benefits? The second thing is the grant implementation approach. So once you've told me what the project is and how it reduced risk, does your application give me confidence in your implementation approach that you can complete that project? It can be successful. We want to look at how the project is innovative, both in either its project planning, maybe the type, or the implementation, how funding is done. We want to look at the populations impacted. So who in your community is going to benefit directly from this project or indirectly from this project? How have you done then in partnership and outreach? How have you outreached to the populations impacted? How have you partnered with other interested groups in project development or project funding? Are you looking at future conditions so that the project you're doing doesn't just reduce risk now, but it reduce risk in the future, whether that's to land use changes, population changes, sea level rise, whatever it might be. And then we're also looking, of course, at infrastructure and community lifelines projects. So more on building codes, because building codes is very specifically talked about in the Section 1234 and the Disaster Recovery Reform Act in general, is that we want to have, it has broad support, legislative broad support for the adoption and enforcement of updated codes. Of course, and so BRIC is taking building codes into a variety of ways into the program. One of those is, as it's been in our HMA programs, any project must be built to the latest 2 building codes or the consensus codes, whichever those codes might be for that type of project. And then the addition of BRIC that's done that the other programs hasn't done is funding building codes projects under the allocation. Community Lifelines is a construct that was created in 2017 to really, in our response, to organize how we would respond to disasters. And we have taken that into BRIC and thought, okay, well, if we know that if we can mitigate the effects to a lifeline from natural hazards, then when the disaster happens, you will see less effects to those lifelines. So we want to educate the mitigation community on the use of lifelines, and we're going to have more coming out with our engagements next month in July. But that is, you know, we are putting or centering our projects around the effects of lifelines or mitigating the effects to lifelines. You'll see when the map comes out, we map all of our projects that are in the map to which lifeline it supports. I just want to give you a couple of different examples of projects that we have, that we funded in the past, that are good for BRIC or are encouraging to BRIC. One is the Underground Resiliency Park in Hoboken, New Jersey. And there's a couple of different things about this that really are good in the BRIC space. One is that it's a green feature, or nature-based solution to something that's very urban. So in this case, you have a very heavily populated area. They have carved out this park. Underneath, it has tons of flood storage. So it has a natural hazard risk reduction to flooding to the area. It also gives an ancillary benefit of a park feature on top, using a lot of green space in the community. As well as, this is a PDM project that had a $10 million federal share and has a $47 million non-federal share. So the increased cost share makes it good for BRIC. A second example is the Resilient St. Vrain, so the St. Vrain Creek in Longmont, Colorado. A couple things about this one: it's a nature-based solution to reduce flooding. It has ancillary benefits that they added in the trail system or the park features onto the project. And I'm not going to go through all the details in this slide in this time, but I did want to talk about project scoping. We saw through our stakeholder feedback that there was a lot of comment about putting more funding towards advanced assistance, and that is, but at the same time, we saw that there was an underutilization of advanced assistance in PDM. So one of the things we've done is we've renamed it into so it really speaks to what it truly is, which is project scoping. And this is money or seed money that's funded to a community or to an applicant to help them develop a project that could then be submitted to BRIC or to any other funding source in the future. We always want to give a nod to our benefit cost analysis, and I want to make sure everyone has the link at the bottom about how to get onto FEMA's website about the BCA. All of our projects in the competition, as well as any kind of mitigation projects that are funded in the allocation, have to be cost effective. And so that either has to be done through the FEMA module or through a pre-calculated benefit if that exists for that project type. So we always want to make sure you have the latest link for where to get access to our BCA. Technical assistance, that was something that was heavily talked about in our stakeholder feedback in the summer of 2019. And so we've created a couple of different ways that we want to do technical assistance, one being that map or that guidebook that I've talked about earlier, the Mitigation Action Portfolio. I've talked a little bit more about the non-financial direct technical assistance, and you'll see information about what that is coming out with the NOFO. In addition, we do webinars, engagements. We're going to have program support materials that accompany our NOFO to help explain the new components of BRIC. And then, of course, we have our regional offices that offer technical assistance to our applicants all the time. A little bit more about these summer engagements. We've got 2 different webinar series that are going to be happening starting in July. This is to educate all of our stakeholders on the BRIC program and the policy and the components of it. The first are going to be more overarching webinars or engagement series. We're calling it the BRIC Summer Engagement Series. That'll happen every Wednesday for an hour, and they will be taped in the month of July. And then once the NOFO is released, we'll flip over to very tactical NOFO webinars in the month of August and September to support the opening of the application period, where we'll be going into very much the details of the program and how to apply. Here's a list of resources. So we do have, I'm very proud of the fact that we were able to get our own website on FEMA, and it's pretty easy to remember. It's fema.gov/BRIC. This is where we hope, as we have things ready for the public, that we put things for BRIC. So if you go on there right now, you'll find our stakeholder feedback. We did a 78-page report based on the 5,000 comments. So you'll find that report, as well as, if you don't have time for the 78 pages, there's a 4-page summary. So you can read about what people told us they needed or wanted to see in the BRIC program. You'll also find out information about BRIC, but that is somewhere I want you really to bookmark, because as we produce materials for BRIC, that's where they'll go. In addition, there's a list of resources on the right that are important to BRIC, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance main website, as well as Community Lifelines, the BCA, Hazard Mitigation Planning, and building codes. So please use those or bookmark all those sites. So thank you so much for your time today. I know that was a quick overview of BRIC. Just as a teaser, ASFPM has been so kind to set up for me to do a webinar with them later this month, which will be 90 minutes in length. So I'm sure they'll be sending out information to their membership about when and where that will be. So I look forward to talking to you at that time. Thank you.
We are back. Thank you for joining us. And we have Camille Crain live to answer some of your questions. First of all, one of the questions we had, good morning, Camille.
Good morning.
Is it reasonable to expect that BRIC program will use a scoring or table criteria similar to what PDM used? And will a BRIC allow IBC 12 compliance versus the restricted IBC 2015 and 2018 only?
So in the first part of the question, yes, we are going to have a scoring criteria using for our competition. That will be coming out with our notice of funding opportunity. So I can't speak to what that scoring criteria is going to look at right now, but hopefully it's going through concurrence. And with the release of the NOFO plan for August, we'll be able to have full details on what that scoring criteria looks like for the competition. In answer to the second question about code compliance, it's actually written in the DRRA that we are to meet one of the latest 2 consensus codes. So for building codes, that would either be 2015 or 2018 IBC and IRC. So all of our projects that are construction projects must be built to one of those 2 sets of codes.
Could you talk a little bit more about assistance and the community and capacity building? Will states be eligible for these fundings, or is this a FEMA direct to the community?
So there's 2 different elements there. The CNCB activities, or capacity and capability building activities, those are part of the allocation. So those are available to our applicants and sub-applicants. So it goes through our states, tribes, and territories as the applicants. As I talked about in the presentation, that includes a certain set of activities such as mitigation planning, building code work, whether the adoption, enforcement, the project scoping, formerly known as advanced assistance, so that's seed money to be able to plan out a project, partnerships, so if you are in the market or want to learn more or try to get more information about how to get partners, we will help fund that activity, training, as well as we're leaving the aperture open that if there's other project types that you can think of that would help build your capacity, build your capability, you can put those in. The technical assistance piece is different. It is actually direct technical assistance and it's non-financial. So there's more to come about that coming out with the NOFO, which I keep giving plugs to the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, that will be coming out hopefully in August. But that will be a part of the program that is directly to communities in a non-financial way, but we will incorporate the applicants.
Are there any alternative BCA methodologies that FEMA is exploring, or are we sticking to traditional?
I'll give a plug for our benefit cost analysis team at FEMA. They are around the clock working on looking at efficiencies in the benefit cost analysis outside of BRIC. I will say there's nothing special about BRIC as it relates to the benefit cost analysis. Anything work that the BCA team does will be for the use of all the 3 of our programs, along with FMA and H&GP. We've had the rule or the piece of our program that if you have other methodologies that you would like to use outside of FEMA's BCA module, you can do that. They just must have prior approval from FEMA, and BRIC will have that same ability in the program.
You mentioned large funding of large infrastructure projects, but we are getting some questions about flood mitigation funding. Will this infrastructure projects include RL and SRL and other high flood risk buildings? And will any of your project applications also require any type of insurance?
So as I said in the presentation, all project types are still eligible. So if our last series of guidance we had was a 2015 HMA guidance, and in that 2015 HMA guidance, there's almost like a laundry list of eligible projects. All project types are still eligible in BRIC. They may be different priorities, and that'll come out with NOFO. As far as, what was the second part of the question, Veronica?
Insurance requirements.
Okay, so insurance requirements, yes, that's a rule that exists that BRIC follows, that is for all of our programs, that if funding goes into a facility or a building that remains in the special flood hazard area after the mitigation is completed, that does have insurance requirements for flood insurance.
All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Let's see. As a new program, how is the new BRIC program approaching its integration with the directives of FEMA's Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration?
So we are, as part of, I spoke in the presentation about the strategic plan. BRIC is a fundamental piece of the strategic plan in the goal number 1 of increasing a culture of preparedness. We also, FEMA has a document of the National Mitigation Investment Strategy. We are closely aligning with that document in BRIC rollout. We also speak to, you may have heard about the mitigation moonshots. So there's a moonshot that FEMA has within FEMA of increasing the federal investment towards resiliency by 4-fold. So we're a piece of that as well.
I think that wraps up our time for our Q&A. And just as a reminder, we are welcoming everybody back to our mitigation programs and grant applications session. And this is sponsored by BRIC. So next, we will be going into our presentation, best practices for large infrastructure projects in the PDM and FMA programs, presented by Eric Kenney, PE and CFM, Senior Project Manager with CDM Smith.
Has gone to sleep. Good evening, but also good morning, everyone. And thanks for taking some time out of your day to listen to this presentation. As my bio blurb noted, I'm a project manager with CDM Smith, and for the last 4 years, I've served as our project manager, providing contractor support for the review of the pre-disaster mitigation and flood mitigation assistance, PDM and FMA programs. Manny Periton, who also contributed significantly to preparing this presentation, has served as the technical lead, but we decided not to try to splice together a presentation today, so I'll be giving this presentation. I'll be presenting some best practices for large infrastructure projects in the PDM and FMA programs based on our observations from the fiscal year 19 National Technical Review Cycle. I'm excited to be able to spend some time today highlighting where we saw improvements over prior years, where we observed best practices this year in this cycle, but also identifying some of the more common pitfalls that we've observed. With PDM moving to BRIC and the increased focus on infrastructure projects this year, we wanted to share some of our observations focused mostly on these larger, more complex projects, but we will touch on the other project types. These larger projects often present the greatest opportunity for community-wide mitigation, but they can also be challenging to document appropriately for the HMA programs. I always like to start these presentations by giving a brief overview of what the applications looked like this year and compare them to last year. These numbers focus on projects, so management costs, planning, and advanced assistance will add to these numbers, both in terms of the number of applications received as well as the federal share requested. Under the PDM program, we saw 321 applications for a federal share of approximately $475 million. This year, $250 million was available. The bulk of these projects being for larger flood control structures and utility and infrastructure retrofits. The categories you see here on the slide are categories that our team creates to help make assignments, so they may differ slightly from what was entered in the application, but give you a general feel for the trend in terms of where the applications came in. In the middle of the group, you'll see $19 million in generator projects. We saw about 60 of these this year, which is consistent with what we saw during the last cycle. Under the FMA program, we saw slightly fewer applications, $290 million in federal share, representing 167 sub-applications. The bulk of these applications, over $220 million, was for acquisition and elevation projects. This year, however, we did see $53 million in flood control projects, which generally capture the larger infrastructure project category. So, what went well this year? Over 68%, or 338, of the applications that were received and reviewed were able to be recommended for further consideration. That is, they passed the National Technical Review. Passing NTR doesn't mean they get selected. Of course, FEMA funding limitations and applicant and FEMA priorities ultimately come into play, but passing the NTR is the first and an important step. We still see the highest number, both dollar-wise and application number, almost half the total of applications, around acquisition and elevation. But we also see over 50 flood control projects and utility infrastructure and retrofit projects that were recommended. And while this doesn't show the breakdown by program, we can also see that we have $495 million in projects moving forward compared to $460 million in total funding. So both programs continue to be oversubscribed. That said, if you did a little math on the last slide, over 68% passing NTR means 151 applications did not make it through the NTR review. Here I'd like to pause for a second and note that about a third of this number, approximately 50, were not reviewed by the NTR team because they were determined to be ineligible by FEMA. The key point from an NTR standpoint is that projects that are considered ineligible are not reviewed by the NTR team, so right out of the gate, approximately 10% of the projects do not have a chance of being funded. I think the most common cause we saw this year was an incomplete application, missing a BCA or other critical document. Taking out the ineligible projects, we get a closer look at projects that did not pass the NTR review. This subset is 101 projects, and 66% of them are in the flood risk reduction or infrastructure retrofit group, projects that would likely be candidates for the BRIC program. And if we look at just those two project types, we see that approximately 44% of them passed NTR. So there's quite a bit of room for improvement here, and that's part of the reason that we're focused on them today. The other project type we see a number of not passing is generators. We see a wide range of BCA methodologies submitted for these, and often the loss history isn't fully supported, and that's why we're seeing that jump out at us on this slide. The other takeaway from this slide is that cost effectiveness and technical feasibility tend to go hand in hand. I'm hard pressed to think of an example where the project has been considered cost effective but not technically feasible. We have seen the reverse, where a project is technically feasible but not cost effective. This often reflects an incomplete or incompletely documented BCA. That is, we understand enough design information to have confidence that the mitigation project will work, but the level of protection or how it will mitigate the identified loss history just isn't clear. Before getting into some specific examples of pitfalls and successes, I want to highlight some key points that are broadly applicable to all the project types that we see, both for large infrastructure as well as really every other project type. BCA version 6, this year we saw about half the applications come in using version 6.0, with the remaining coming in version 5.3. I think we all agreed that 6.0 is clearly more user-friendly. It obviously requires less inputs to produce a BCR. That said, the needs for supporting documentation still remains. So even though there's not necessarily a field to attach a file like we had in 5.3, documentation to support the inputs is still needed, and it's no different than the requirements of 5.3. The BCA narrative, these are not required. That said, they're probably the most valuable piece of information in an application when they are included. Not only do they provide a description of how the BCA was assembled, they often include the supporting documentation in one location. Now, this is obviously great for our review team, but it all helps them understand the inputs. But also, if there are errors in the BCA as submitted, it allows the reviewers to understand the intended input and potentially correct the BCA. Again, not required, but I think if we had one recommendation out of this cycle, it would be to include a narrative wherever possible. Recurrence intervals. Whether these are calculated in the tool based on a loss history or entered for known events, documenting the loss history or the source of the recurrence interval analysis is key. Each year we see an application or two that uses the RI as the time between events, rather than the statistical likelihood of the event occurring. Just because it occurred twice in the last 6 years, it does not make it a 3-year event. But on the other hand, you could have events that occur in consecutive years, and those could actually be 100-year events. Previous cycle memos. I think these memos that we produce are getting shared pretty consistently now. In fact, this year we saw a few cases where a project that did not pass the NTR last year addressed the concerns by providing additional information, and we were able to recommend it for consideration. And that was exactly the goal of having these memos and having them shared, is providing feedback that allows the applications to be improved. FMA infrastructure projects. FMA projects need to benefit NFIP insured structures. So while not a key focus of our reviewers, clearly showing the benefiting area of the projects and the structures in that area help not only understand the project for our BCA and technical review process, which is our focus, but also for the programmatic reviews. Future conditions. We're starting to see more projects include future conditions, specifically sea level rise. The main point here that is if it's included in the pre and post mitigation risk, it should also be included in the design. Consistency. And finally, this is probably the second most important point, is consistency across the application. Making sure that the scope matches the BCA and that the discussion and documentation of pre and post mitigation risk also matches the BCA. The clearest example of this is if the level of protection is 100 years, we would expect to see residual risk at larger events. But if there were damages anticipated at a 10 or 20-year event, it raises questions regarding the effectiveness of the project. With that, I'm going to move into a few examples of what we've seen for successes or pitfalls around a few key areas. Clearly defined scope, key BCA inputs, BCA methodology, and level of protection. The text you're going to see is pulled directly from memos from this cycle, with some identifying information removed to protect the innocent. So, clearly defined scope. The scope should describe the project, the hazard that's being mitigated, and ideally the design standard being applied to the project. For acquisition projects, this might be as simple as a statement saying we're going to acquire and demolish a residential structure. But for more complex projects, it really should provide information about how the project will be accomplished. For flood risk reduction or other infrastructure projects, there isn't a single applicable design standard, but as much as possible, acknowledging plan conformance to local design and construction requirements, perhaps as a local utility, DOT or water, stormwater management district, allows the reviewer to understand that the project will be designed and constructed to an applicable standard. When you're describing the scope, and even before figuring out the project, the addendum to FEMA's HMA guidance has a list of ineligible activities. If the project describes implementing something off that list, and it includes the cost for that, that's of course going to be a concern. And the project may not even make it to the NTR team. FEMA has a HMA helpline that can help answer questions about program requirements to avoid spending effort on a project that does not even meet these requirements, and then that wouldn't make it to the NTR team for review and consideration. I had a lot of examples, both successful and pitfalls for this slide, but I picked a seismic one to keep things a little more interesting. Each input in the BCA, of course excluding standard values, needs to be supported. We often see numbers in the BCA that produce a BCR of 1 or 2 or 3 or 40, but the entries aren't supported by the application data, or in the cases of the pitfall example, contradicted by the application. This, again, is where a BCA narrative can be especially helpful. First, it helps organize your thoughts as you're assembling a BCA to make sure each input is supported. Whether it's a detour map to show travel times and distances, an H&H analysis that provides flood depths, or a building vulnerability assessment that provides key parameters for a seismic retrofit project. I mentioned this before, but the other benefit of the BCA narrative is that if there is a data entry error, a decimal point or some numbers transposed, it allows the NTR reviewers to understand the intended value and potentially correct it. If there isn't any information supporting the inputs, the BCA often can't be verified, and the project risks being considered not cost effective. Documentation for cost effectiveness needs to be provided no matter what. It may be pre-calculated benefits for an acquisition project, or it may be a complex multi-structure analysis done in version 6.0, but it's needed. And we still see applications where it's omitted completely. And these probably form a large fraction of the projects that are not recommended for consideration. On the other end of the spectrum, and this is the success we have here, we'll see a BCA for a more unique project where the approach is well described and supported by clear documentation. In this case, a communication with the BCA helpline. As a quick aside, they're a great resource, and while they can't do the BCA for you, they provide guidance and direction on more unique scenarios, such as this one, where a catastrophic failure scenario was caused by a slope eroding at a documented rate. Related to slope stability or failure, a quick comment on the landslide acquisition methodology. This tool, it's an Excel sheet. It's an efficient way to look at structures at risk of an imminent failure of a landslide or a sinkhole, actually. The key point for this methodology are, one, it needs to have a documented risk of imminent failure. This is usually provided by a design professional. And two, the mitigation measure is acquisition. While slope stabilization projects may prevent a landslide, this tool doesn't consider residual risk since it's based on acquisition projects. So the tool is only appropriate for using when the structure at the top of the slope or adjacent to a sinkhole is being acquired. Some project types lend themselves to a clear commitment to a design standard or level of protection, while others require something a little more project specific. The clearest example of a design standard for me is FEMA 320 and 361 for safe rooms. There are a few caveats, of course, but generally speaking, a statement that the project will be designed and constructed to these standards is sufficient to understand that the project will function as anticipated. I touched on this in the scope of work discussion, but identifying the design standard, perhaps a local DOT or flood control district requirement, and showing that the project is designed to this requirement provides a standard and level of protection that support both the technical and cost effectiveness reviews. Related to this level of protection, it's crucial to consider not only the physical damages, but also loss of function, especially as we're dealing with infrastructure. For critical facilities that provide water or wastewater or electricity or emergency services, the benefits from avoided loss of function can often far outweigh the benefits from avoided physical damages and can often make the difference between a project being considered cost effective or not. If you don't have enough information at the stage when you're thinking about putting together an application, consider applying for advanced assistance. This allows you to advance the project from a concept to a more fleshed out design that provides enough information to obtain hopefully, funding to move the project into either final design or hopefully construction. To kind of wrap this all up, I want to touch on maybe one key point for most of the project types that we see. These are not all infrastructure, but as we saw early on, acquisition and elevation still make up a significant portion of the projects that we see, and we certainly don't want to lose sight of the need to maintain the quality of those applications, share lessons learned, and continue to improve them. So generators mitigate a lot of different risks, from high winds to snow to power lines going down due to accidents. Accordingly, we see a wide range of BCA approaches. Here, documenting the loss history is probably the single most important part of showing a generator project to be cost effective. Safe rooms. These have consistently had a very high passing rate because of the requirement to meet 320 or 61. One thing that we often see is that the population served is not clearly documented. And in cases where the design population is greater than the size of the community, it may impact the cost effectiveness if the population served is far less than the capacity. Acquisition and elevation projects, specifically those being considered with predetermined or pre-calculated benefits, over 90% of these projects, it's probably even over 95% pass. But we do consistently see projects with structures outside the special flood hazard area or with the project cost exceeding the pre-calculated benefits limits. Of course, a location factor can be used, but when comparing the project cost to the predetermined benefits, it needs to be the total project cost, not just the federal share. Seismic retrofit projects. The seismic projects that are the most successful are those with a structure-specific vulnerability assessment, especially because each structure can be fairly unique. Understanding the existing risk and the post-mitigation condition often requires some additional work up front. Wildfire, we see very, very different documentation depending on the sub-applicant, but if I had to pick two pieces of information, a map showing the project area, including the benefiting structures, as well as information on the building replacement value, would be the top two on my list. Those have the biggest impact on the project potentially moving forward. Slope stability, similar to seismic retrofit, slope stability projects with an engineering analysis that quantifies the pre- and post-mitigation risks are the most successful because the slope and soil conditions are going to be site-specific. We often see these projects protecting infrastructure, so in addition to physical damages or cleanup costs, identifying the population served or the traffic impacts of a failure are often critical to demonstrating the cost effectiveness. Flood risk reduction, LFEs and BFEs. Documenting the base flood elevation and, of course, the other flood elevations, as well as the lowest floor elevation, it still remains a challenge. An elevation certificate remains the best way to correctly identify the LFE, but if you don't have one, looking at the elevation certificate instructions to understand how your structure type should be measured is a great way to get that right. Moving the LFE or BFE by a foot or two, or 8 or 10 in the case of being off a story, makes a huge change. Wind retrofits. Make sure that the entire building envelope is considered. Each year we see applications for shutters or doors on structures where the building assessment indicates that the roof needs replacement or that the existing building envelope cannot support the design wind speed load of the shutters. Shutters are great, but if the roof comes off or the wall fails, they don't do much good. Thank you for your time today, and I hope some of this was useful. If I'm looking at my clock correctly, I think I wrapped this up a little faster than I anticipated, so we have a few more minutes for questions. So happy to take any you may have now. Additionally, my email is there at the bottom of that final slide. So if you do have any follow-on questions, feel free to reach out, and happy to share any information I might have. Thank you, and have a great day.
And we are here for our Q&A with Eric Kenney and Manny Periton. on the best practices for large infrastructure projects in PDM and FMA programs. So, guys, how are you? And one of our first questions is, do you find that communities are primarily submitting applications or grants on what they think will be funded rather than something that's a priority, say as focusing on an elevation versus reaching out and doing an education and awareness program?
Eric, you want to take that one?
Thanks, Veronica. I think it's probably a couple things. You know, we certainly see community. Sure, and am I coming through? Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit, Eric.
Do you want to take it then?
Sure. So I guess ultimately we see I guess a mixture of them. You know, I think we've seen a variety of you know, some small level elevation projects. You have one or two at a time, whereas others that are widespread. And then you also see some of the large infrastructure projects. You know, the past couple of years, there's been the opportunity under PDM to have I think up to a $10 million federal share project, and we've seen that. So, but I would say that there are some times that we see applications and we wonder whether or not the sub applicants even knew what the priorities were in the NOFO. So there's a wide variety ultimately.
Our next question is, do you know of any plans for FEMA to streamline the PDM application process, which I believe we now know will be the new BRIC program?
So I think I do know across the board there's an initiative. It's a site that they're looking. It's called FEMA Go, and I think BRIC. You know, for years the pre-disaster mitigation, or PDM, has been on an e-grants platform. I don't think the intent is for BRIC to be on that. I think that's going to be entirely on the newer FEMA Go platform. So I think that should or may help with the streamlining of the application process. Other than that, that's the only thing that I'm aware of or can think of. I know Camille presented on the previous one. She may want to reach out to her and see if there's any initiatives on that. But the main thing that comes to mind right now is FEMA Go.
What would your recommendations be for projects in a lower income or rural area that perhaps does not have the benefit due to low property values?
You know, the main thing that comes to mind with that is maybe advanced assistance, or I'm drawing blank right now with the terms that Camille used earlier, that they're going to call it under BRIC, I think. You know, using that funding to help with, you know, one, designing or conceptually preparing the project, and then two, identifying potentially all the benefits that are out there. You know, I think we focus a lot on the physical damages that are being avoided. There might be other damages such as loss of function. You know, all these families have to be displaced, and the cost of being displaced is the same for everybody, whether you're come from a low property value or not. And then there's other services that are being provided. Maybe the infrastructure in that area is also being damaged. We look at infrastructure the same across the board as well. So I would say capitalize on that advanced assistance, maybe project scoping, I think is the term. I think it finally came to me. So use project scoping and maybe advanced assistance to help with fully capturing it. And I don't know if it'll work into it or not, but one thing we also we're trying to encourage for BRIC, especially for these larger projects, is potentially attend webinars that are offered in preparation as far as the NOFO is released. I think there'll be some webinars and ask those type of questions. What are some of the other benefits that I could consider? Because a lot of the applications we review, I will say, have left a lot of benefits on the table, and we don't have enough data to make assumptions to help them figure out what those benefits are.
An additional question. You touched on BCA shifting from version 5.3 to 6.0, and as we've seen, it's more of an Excel-based format. And what are your recommendations for more successful front-loading for BCA, for your benefit cost analysis, in order to ensure that everyone has what needs to be reviewed?
Sure. So, you know, one of our lessons learned feedback was we call a BCA narrative. I think trying to tell the story of what your project is, the hazard and the risk that the project is reducing. Having a narrative for that, and along with documentation to support the assumptions that went into it. In the old version of the software in version 5, you had the ability to attach documents that kind of went along with the numbers as you inputted them. Now in Excel, you don't have that exact same functionality. You can enter in text, but you can't put in an attachment. So just have that narrative, and then maybe some attachments to go along with it to support some of the assumptions you're making is the primary thing that comes to mind for me. And I'm just looking at the other screen over here, and yeah, Camille just said project scoping, so we're good there. Advanced assistance equals project scoping.
We seem to have gotten another question. Pre-calculated benefits for applications that were not successful.
Yeah, so 2 things that come to mind for pre-calculated benefits: buildings that weren't outside the special flood hazard area. We were able to, in some cases, go out and verify maybe there was an advisory map or prelim map. We just didn't look at the effective firm, so we could find it on any firm. We used that. We also went to the flood insurance policies, and if a house is being rated as being in the special flood hazard area, then we also considered it. So, but the reasons why they didn't succeed is there was no evidence of it being in the special flood hazard area, or in some cases, you just do the math, you multiply the number of, let's say, 10 structures by 10 times the pre-calculated benefits, and then you compare that to the costs, and the costs exceeded those pre-calculated benefits. We still had some of those circumstances where the pre-calculated benefits, times the number of structures weren't sufficient to show that the project was cost effective. For those, generally speaking, what we would try and do at least is make a recommendation for maybe 9 of the 10 structures and say, hey, this 10th structure it costs the most, and it's the one that's making it not cost effective as a whole. In some cases, we were able to make a recommendation for those moving forward.
So to clarify, the pre-calculated benefit on structures outside of the special flood hazard area was specific for a flood mitigation assistance grant. And as long as you can provide documentation to show that it's somewhere within a mapped floodplain.
Correct. So those pre-calculated benefits that I was assuming applied to acquisitions and elevations, because those are the 2 that have the condition that you have to be in the special flood hazard area. And to apply those benefits, that structure, at least 1 square inch of it needs to be in the floodplain. Think of it as if you were to apply for a flood insurance policy, if you're going to be rated as being in the floodplain, then we're going to apply the benefits, whether it's today or if it's in the future when that map becomes effective.
Have you seen many applications submit base level engineering data and maps in order to quantify that? Yes, we are starting to see those. I would say just off the top of my head, Region 6, and I think they're the ones who happen to be probably where a predominant amount of those studies are being done. They come to mind. The states in Region 6 are where we've seen those base level engineering maps or floodplains used to apply these benefits, and that's another I would say acceptable source for identifying a special flood hazard area. BLE data we've answered.
Okay. Yeah.
There was an additional question: is is there a website or a place other than your presentation where someone can go look at some of the practices and common pitfalls that you've described?
Off the top of my head, there probably isn't anything other than these presentations. And normally these are webinars that are given after every NOFO. So we try and do this kind of outreach at conferences like this. And I think the intent by grants implementation is to offer a similar webinar they've done in years past once the NOFO comes out. And I think once that webinar is made, a recording is made available. The second thing that comes to mind is a lot of job aids. So if you look up HMA job aids, those job aids in essence are trying to help you mitigate against these pitfalls. So I would say they may not list these pitfalls the same way this presentation does, but following those job aids will help you avoid them.
And I think we're squeezing in a few more here.
All right.
You may not be able to answer this, but
sure.
How do you feel risk rating 2.0 will affect the benefits to flood maps where flood maps aren't a potential player?
I have I have no idea, other than I think if the insurance rate at a certain house is going to increase enough, I think you're going to see more interest in this program. On the other hand, if you may see less interest in certain communities because their premium went down. So I think in areas where they're ultimately, I think the only thing I can answer to that is if their premium goes up enough, I think you're going to see people more interested in these types of grants, willing to apply for an acquisition or an elevation.
Someone did ask more specifically on in areas where BLE data is available and used, are properties that are in the SFHA on firms viewed at as more favorably than properties that are using BLE data, or are they on the same level?
I would say you have to check the NOFO to see if there's anything specific to that. But from a pre-calculated benefit standpoint, there's no difference. It's in the special flood hazard area. The benefits apply the same. And I think the NOFO outlines SRL properties at the top, RL are next, and that type of thing. So I think the NOFO priorities would drive it. I think we'll basically use the BLE to help support that the properties at risk of flooding. From a priority standpoint, I would kind of defer to the NOFO or how the state prioritizes the project when they submit it. So that's another factor. The state ranks their projects when they submit them. So depending on what project's in, then that might be a factor as well.
I think we're coming close to the end of our Q&A time. So I want to thank you again, Eric Kenney and Manu Periton with CDM Smith for your presentations. And this was sponsored by Flood BRIC. And if you'll stay tuned, we will be transitioning over to our next presentation.
Thanks, everybody.
All right,
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
First of all, I just want to say that I really appreciate this opportunity to connect with all of you today. And the idea behind today's presentation is really just to talk about a little bit about the relationship between hazard mitigation planning and historic preservation. And really, if nothing else, just highlight the importance of addressing historic preservation as part of any local community planning process. So what are we talking about in this session? One thing that I would like to touch on a little bit is my background, how I got interested in historic preservation as part of hazard mitigation planning. A couple of pieces of guidance that have come out, National Park Service guidance and also guidance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency that we can talk about just a little bit today, and then a series of case studies from North Carolina. The title of the presentation is A History of Historic Preservation and Hazard Mitigation in North Carolina, and this is certainly not comprehensive, but it is in chronological order, and it does touch on a few different project types and some things that I think will be of interest to you, just kind of in the context of this 25-minute presentation. And I do want to end with a few conclusions and opportunities. And I will say that what I'm showing today, these are not Moffatt and Nichol projects per se. This is coming from my experience as a hazard mitigation planner and some things that I've been exposed to through various opportunities in North Carolina, working with North Carolina Emergency Management and the State Historic Preservation Office and others. So I hope that you find this information useful. And hopefully a little bit interesting as well. So as far as my background goes, I really got interested in this topic following Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I was part of a project called a Mitigation Assessment Team Report, sort of a building performance assessment exercise where we were looking at damages across Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana from flooding, storm surge, and wind as a result of Hurricane Katrina. And as we were looking at all of those different types of impacted buildings, residential homes, critical facilities, hotels, casinos, as we got to historic buildings, and certainly if you think of communities like New Orleans, Biloxi, all up and down the Gulf Coast, there's a lot of history there and a lot of unique construction, unique building stock there. And so as we were looking at the types of damages we were seeing, and as we were talking about mitigation alternatives, mitigation recovery advisories, and things like that, we quickly realized that we needed to talk about historic buildings a little bit differently. And so we were actually able to draft a separate chapter just on historic buildings as part of that. Now, kind of going along with that, I've also been doing mitigation planning for almost 20 years now. And so looking at the evolution of local mitigation planning, kind of along that 5-year planning cycle, I've seen a lot of changes and a lot of evolution in terms of not just the plan itself, but the risk assessments. And what we started out looking at with those first generation plans around 2003, 2004, looking at really what you could consider a lot of the basics, laying the foundation for those first generation plans, looking at residential properties, commercial, industrial. But then as those plans began to be updated and additional funding was available, additional resources, new technologies, advancements in GIS technology and data sets, looking more at critical facilities, different types of infrastructure, agricultural lands, educational buildings, schools used as shelters, breaking out new dimensions of the maps and the tables that we had drafted initially. And sort of the one trend that we're seeing is now a desire to look at historic preservation, cultural assets, and other things that are of community value that may not have been the higher priorities early on in the planning process. Comparing a hospital or police, fire, rescue stations against maybe an abandoned movie theater on Main Street or an old oak tree at the corner that may have some community significance but may not have been the first thing to think of in terms of mitigation planning and mitigation dollars. And this ties in really well, I think, with the newer thinking on whole community resiliency. Not just looking at what is essential to a community's preparedness from an emergency management standpoint or even floodplain management standpoint, but looking at what defines the community. What is of value to the residents? Why is that community unique? And why do people live there? So some of the guidance that's come out that I think connects with all of this and sort of helps support all of this is a couple of things from the National Park Service, guidelines on flood adaptation or mitigation for rehabilitating historic buildings. This came out in November of last year, so it's still fairly new. I was at a conference, a state chapter conference a few months ago before COVID-19 had really hit, and asked for a show of hands in terms of who had heard of this guidance, and not many people had at that point. So that was great. Hopefully the same thing here. I can help heighten awareness of this guidance and something for you to look at. But it builds upon the standard guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings, which are the guidelines for any property on the National Register. But these guidelines, these new ones, are specifically for flood mitigation. So anything that's true in terms of do's or don'ts or best practices from the standard guidelines, that's just enhanced by what you may want to do or can and cannot do additionally, specifically for the flood hazard. Now, in addition to that, FEMA has a publication that's been around for years called Integrating Historic Property and Cultural Resource Considerations into Hazard Mitigation Planning. This is FEMA 386. It's part of the old How-To series. Still a lot of good information in that. So you read both of these together, I think you get a really good perspective and a good starting point. Now, looking just at the newer guidance from the National Park Service, they list out a series of conventional, what they call conventional treatments, what we would call mitigation techniques or mitigation alternatives. And a lot of these are going to sound very familiar. But the first one is planning and assessment, which is recommended at the start of any project, which is a great idea. I mean, you've had an event, there's always a tendency to go out and repair and replace, buy the materials, hire the contractors, get it fixed back the way that it was as quickly as possible. But of course, you can go through a planning stage, an assessment stage, look at maybe a better way to restore things that factor in flood mitigation, that perhaps meet multiple objectives, multiple sources of flooding perhaps. So it's always a good idea to step back and have that planning and assessment stage. And then the next two items on the list are considered those types of techniques that have a less intrusive nature in terms of changing the historic property, which is always a consideration. One is temporary protective measures. So that could be anything like sandbags or temporary flood walls, floodgates, utility protection, elevating utilities, moving electrical or HVAC heating equipment. A lot of times that factors in a lot less to the historic significance, the look and feel, and the nature of the property. The rest of these on the list are a little bit more intrusive. They're going to change the appearance or the aesthetic a little bit more, and these are ones that you certainly would need more time planning, more time assessing. But again, some of these are going to sound familiar. But with site and landscape adaptations, the one thing that I will mention there that's a little bit unique for historic properties, keep in mind that with historic properties, it may not just be the building that has significance. And with the traditional FEMA mitigation projects, we do tend to focus a lot on the buildings, not necessarily the lot, not necessarily the grounds, the front yard, the backyard. But looking at historic properties, that may be where some or all or maybe most of the significance lies. It could be a battlefield. It could be a cemetery, a tree, a site where some historic document may have been signed or a wedding may have taken place. So anytime a mitigation alternative is going to alter the landscape or cause a permanent mark on that, that could be something that needs to be taken into consideration. But dry and wet floodproofing, I think most of us are familiar with that as a technique. Filling in of the basement. Some of these do seem a little bit extreme, but a lot of these just take careful coordination, communication, understanding of those do's and don'ts, and again, that planning and assessment stage. Elevating the structure, that's a very common technique that we're all familiar with. Elevating the interior of the structure. I've seen this done in some cases with historic Main Street district where you might have small businesses. Elevating that first floor as you walk in so that you walk up a series of steps out onto a floor. It elevates your inventory, your point of sale, a lot of your electrical so that if there is a flood, maybe even with floodgates, you can help prevent some of that flooding and some of that damage to your assets actually within the store. Abandoning the first story. This is a more extreme technique, but again, can be permissible in a lot of cases. I've seen this done in some cases where it's a restaurant or a bed and breakfast, and what used to be the ground floor is now maybe parking area. And the new first floor, which used to be the second floor, is now a restaurant or a bed and breakfast, whatever that new usage is. And then relocation. Again, it seems a little extreme, but I've seen this done with hotels. We're going to talk about a lighthouse in just a few minutes, where that actually becomes part of that property story. And it's protected, it's saved. If that was the only way to remove it from harm's way, you change the location, but you keep the building. And with all of these, there's a lot to understand. Details about the location and the conditions at the site. Again, fully understanding the historic significance, not just of the building and maybe the contents, but also the grounds around it or other features around it. Fully understanding the flood risk. Is it riverine? Is it coastal? Is it stormwater? Is it rainfall driven? Is it a combination? Is there erosion as a factor? So again, as you're looking at solving one problem, you might could look at a broader solution that meets multiple objectives and eliminates other threats of flooding at that location. Understanding physical attributes, the features, materials, and architectural styles of the building. And then moving into some of our examples, I'm going to talk about these fairly quickly, but this is a famous one for North Carolina, the Cape Hatteras Light Station relocation. The lighthouse was built in 1870. The site actually consists of 7 historic buildings, not just the lighthouse. But at the time that it was relocated in 1999, it was 120 feet from the shore. Now, originally, it was 1,500 feet from the shore. So through coastal erosion, a lot of that land had been lost, shoreline had been lost, and it was dangerously close to the edge. So it was relocated 2,900 feet inland. You see here kind of a lift with steel rail roadway and one of these images here. It was moved back 2,900 feet, and its new distance from shore is 1,600 feet. So the difference in the numbers there is because between its relocation and today, additional shoreline has been lost. And a lot of that was lost after Hurricane Isabel in 2003. So had it remained where it was, 120 feet from the shore, it would have been lost over this period of time had it not been relocated. So another project, this was a series of projects. This was following Hurricane Fran in 1996 in eastern North Carolina. There were a large number of elevation projects that were being looked at the time. And as that began to happen, a lot of questions began to be raised about the older building stock, not just the pre-firm houses, but those that were on the National Register, part of historic districts, that had either federal, state, or local historic significance, or even just historic significance to the homeowner. But in those cases, can we elevate them? Should we elevate them? What can be done to protect these buildings? And so there was careful coordination between the State Historic Preservation Officer, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, and a lot of questions about, let's take a look at this. What if we elevate the structure, can we keep the same style of brick that we have on the front of the house, for example, also on the elevated portion that we elevate? If we're already using wood railing painted white, can we use wood railing painted white for new sections that are added to perhaps new steps, so that the materials match, the colors match? And maybe not exactly. If you're dealing with vintage materials, a lot of times there's discoloration and weathering from over the years. But if you're at least asking those questions and looking at what materials may match the best, it doesn't become as jarring, and it doesn't change the appearance of the structure quite as much if you are taking those aesthetics into account, primarily to maintain the look and feel of the original state of those homes. Now, I want to look at a few examples on Ocracoke Island, again in North Carolina. These 4 were done fairly recently. And a couple of aspects of all 4 of these, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this first point, but historic property tax credits were a large part of these 4 projects, elevation projects, as well as looking at elevating their HVAC systems and the utilities on each. But looking very quickly at the Bragg Fulcher House in Ocracoke, this image is an after rehabilitation photo. The home was elevated in 2004. It was elevated approximately 2 feet higher, and the owner added the picket fence to help reduce the visual change of the elevation. So what I've kind of been referring to this as is a little bit, if you will, of Disney magic. That as you walk down the street and look at this house, the picket fence sort of helps create an illusion that sort of helps disguise the elevated portion of the house. And I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that the homeowner will paint the picket fence white to help that match the railing and the rest of the property. But again, if you're looking at walking down the street and looking at whether or not that elevation looks jarring, if it changes the nature of the neighborhood, if other houses on either side are not elevated, it sort of helps things to blend together a little bit and create a more natural aesthetic. And one interesting thing about this site, if you look at historic documentary photos of this site, you actually see over time that the elevation appears to change anyway because of changes in movement of the sand and grass. And so it actually looks like the elevation of the home has actually changed over time when it really hasn't. It's been the ground that has changed. So this elevation, it sort of plays a few tricks with you as you look at all of the historic photos. So the next one is the Emma and Simon O'Neill house. These are some before and after rehabilitation images. This home was elevated around 2014, over 3 feet higher than the original elevation. Prior to the rehabilitation, portions of the house in the rear section sat at or below grade. The owner had soil added around the base. A slightly wider skirt board or porch was added, and the homeowner also added an additional row of shingles around the perimeter to help disguise the added height. So again, blending things together, making things look more natural and keeping the original aesthetic. So the bottom right image shows the house after Hurricane Dorian in 2019. Water did not enter the house, but it did get into the ductwork on the rear portion that steps down from the main portion of the house. So again, even though that got wet, without the elevation project, we would have seen a lot more water enter the actual structure. So this is the Will Willis store and fish house, built around 1930, again in Ocracoke. Was recently and successfully elevated 2 feet, and a new structural support system, dock, and platform were constructed to protect this surviving building from flooding and storms. The building is owned and operated as a museum by the Ocracoke Foundation. The work was completed about 2 weeks prior to Hurricane Dorian. So this one was cutting in a little bit close. But while the building did get flooded, the site received over a foot of flooding from Dorian. It came through with minor damage, and the feeling of the community was that the building would not have survived Hurricane Dorian had it not been for the elevation and the dock work that was done. So this is the Tillman O'Neill house, and I had to have at least one set of photos that have the traditional National Register plaque, so you see that there. These are a couple of post-Dorian images. This historic home was elevated a few months before Dorian to the base flood elevation, to the BFE. While water came up to the porch, you can see the staining on the shingles. It's sort of a high water mark there. Fortunately, it did not enter the house. So again, even though it did get close, without the elevation project, it certainly would have been flooded, and there would have been damages there associated with that. These are some in-progress images of the elevation. Again, if you look at the arrows, you can see the effort that was made to, as the chimney work was extended, the elevation work was done there. The brick is matched up, the shingles on the side of the house. Again, it's not going to match exactly to the original materials, but matching it as best you can, looking at the stain, the style, the construction techniques, the craftsmanship, blending those things together so that they are a little bit more consistent, and then also looking at another example of elevated utilities there. So what is the point of all this? What are the conclusions and opportunities for all of us? I would say that the first thing is to consider adding historic preservation to your mental checklist for your daily programs routine, whether that is emergency management, hazard mitigation planning, comprehensive planning, floodplain management, code enforcement, community resilience, post-disaster recovery, whether it's short-term or long-term. Being that person in the room who speaks up about the historic properties in the area. What can we do about them? They may not be the highest priority or the first priority, but they can be a priority. And at some point, as funding and resources come into play, those things can be addressed, hopefully at some point. Also, consider appropriate guidance in decision making. Again, be the one in the room that has a library of good guidance documents for this. I've mentioned a couple here today. Of course, your state agencies may have some as well, your county and local agencies. So be the one familiar with those and what you can and cannot do or should and should not do with respect to the historic properties. And again, heighten awareness for that within the community. And actively look for opportunities to highlight historic significance in the local planning process, wherever that may be. So I wanted to leave you with a few links. You see the link here to the National Park Service guidelines that we talked about earlier on, as well as the FEMA how-to guide. And also just my email address at Moffatt and Nichol. If there's anything that I can do to help you or chat with you about any of this, I'd be happy to help any way I can. So you have that. And with that, I will just say thank you.
And thank you, everyone. We are now entering our question and answer session with Mike Robinson of Moffatt and Nichol. And one of our first questions, Mike, is where do you see the importance of mitigation planning as far as opportunities for historic structures?
Sure. I think kind of like as I touched on in the presentation, as we've developed a lot of those maps and tables and text around all the different aspects of community assets that are important to us, I think, historic properties are worth a similar breakout, and we can begin to define the opportunities, the mitigation alternatives, where the local community benefits lie for those. And again, not just in direct physical impacts, but also on other aspects that are important to the community's identity.
One of our next questions is specific to certified local government eligibilities. Question is that refers to historic buildings being defined as those listed on a national registry. But not all communities are a certified local government. So what would be the mitigation resource availability to non-CLG local historic district buildings?
Sure. And I think part of that depends on the agencies that you're working with. I think I saw the question in the feed there. I think specific to the community, if you look at the regional hazard mitigation plan and what is identified there in terms of mitigation goals, mitigation actions, what's sort of established there if you're talking about HMA funding for projects, elevation projects, or projects that would be eligible under the HMA programs, that is going to be a little bit different, I think, than looking at National Park Service and the National Register aspect of it. So, I think it's understanding what work you want to see done, what the project is, and then identifying appropriate funding sources. I know a lot of times we try to say, how can I get this program to work with this project, or, how can I get this project to work with this program? I think it's really understanding all the programs, all the potential project types, and kind of seeing what in the end may be the best fit. And local ordinances certainly play an important aspect of that, as does the regional or local hazard mitigation plan.
Typically, where do you see the biggest pushback when you're looking at doing some of these mitigation projects? Are you seeing it or resistance when you're modifying a historic structure? Is it usually the state historic preservation office, local entities, or some other group?
Sure. I think it's varied, obviously, from community to community and state to state. I think if I had to answer that, especially with those, three multiple choice options, I think I would probably say local groups that may have a strong opinion about change or resistance to change, local advocacy groups or that sort of thing that may have that strong desire one way or the other. I think other levels with the property owners, and with state and federal agencies, I think there tends to be a lot of open-mindedness in terms of, we understand the issue and we do want to find a solution that works for everyone, for the property owners, for all of the different dynamics of that have to work.
Okay, so Mike, FEMA addresses historic preservation and environmental compliance in several documents. How do you see ways to incorporate the environmental compliance back into the mitigation planning process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in addition to what is sort of required as part of the planning process and the project identification and scoping process, I think there are opportunities to adopt additional reference documents, local, state, federal by reference, and also in appendices where we can begin to call out and maybe draw some more direct connections between those requirements and that guidance with what we're trying to do. I think a lot of times we tend to say that we are sort of in name or meeting some of those requirements, but I think in looking at the nature of it, the intent of it, and trying to incorporate that more directly into the hazard mitigation plan or the way that the mitigation actions are developed, I think that can help bring that to the forefront and help make sure that not just the minimum requirements are being addressed, but that all aspects of environmental and historic preservation compliance are really being looked at.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Mike, and appreciate your time and your presentation, and want to thank everyone for participating in our FEMA mitigation programs and grant application session, which was sponsored by BRIC, and we hope you enjoyed the rest of your program.